Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. In today's Russia, nearly 1 in 5 citizens is not ethnically Russian. Yet, in Putin's school system, only 1% of pupils are allowed to study in their own language. The rest, they're learning Russian or learning nothing at all. Minority languages are vanishing, teachers are retiring and never being replaced, and whole nations are being reduced to a colorful folk dance shown once a year on TV. Welcome to the Folklorization of the Russian Empire, where diversity is celebrated only as long as it doesn't speak for itself. Vladimir Putin is trying to build one Russia by silencing all others. Language is also identity, agency, memory, and sometimes resistance. And here, a state decides which language lives and which one dies. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia is a multi-ethnic state. According to the United Nations, it has the world's third largest immigrant population at over 11 million. Despite this, the Russian government seems hell-bent on erasing this cultural and ethnic diversity. Earlier this year, a law was introduced in Russia which required the children of non-Russian citizens to pass a very difficult Russian language exam before they were allowed to enroll in school. Public opinion in Russia itself is divided. Supporters claim that it will help the children integrate better, while critics say it blocks their right to education. As of June 2025, only 7% of foreign citizen children had passed the exam. This language pressure is also coupled with different Russian policy intertwined with military propaganda. Russia has been making a push to promote army worship in its schools, showing just what sort of integration the Kremlin is really after. Migrants living in Russia are only one side to this tale, however. Russia's indigenous population is also suffering from a lack of support and recognition. While recently the Kremlin introduced 2 holidays meant to celebrate both the languages and cultures of Russia's indigenous peoples, activists have raised the alarm that this decision hides a far more nefarious aim. For years, the Russian government has been carrying out a Russification campaign of its indigenous populations, which has been focused on promoting both Russian culture and language at the expense of their own traditions.
And now, let's zone in on the East-planning portion of our show. The process of Russification is one that Russia has been employing since its imperial era. It is no different in the case of Vladimir Putin's Russia, which has been methodically attempting to stifle Ukrainian culture in occupied territories.
School in the parts of Ukraine that Russia has occupied since the start of the war, like Mariupol, is anything but a place where children learn and are allowed to develop themselves. It has become a tool of Russian propaganda and the heart of Moscow's Russification process of occupied territories. Moscow aims to make these lands even more Russian than the Russian Federation itself, a plan that was heavily utilized by the Soviet Union and Imperial Russia before it.
Teachers have been forced to teach a Russian curriculum. They've been forced to use and apply Russian textbooks that teach a Russian view of history. Teachers are forced to teach in Russian, so children are now studying in Russian for the most part.
Russia is looking to take all of this even further, however. The Russian Education Ministry is poised to remove the study of the Ukrainian language from the curriculum in primary and secondary schools in occupied territories. Such decisions have already been made in the past in the parts of Ukraine that Russia has controlled for longer, like Crimea or parts of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. In Vladimir Putin's Russia, the school curriculum is increasingly becoming a political manifesto, and one written in only one language. Today, just 1% of pupils in the Russian Federation study in a non-Russian language school. That number is half of what it was 9 years ago and a fraction of the number of citizens whose native language is not Russian. Officially, there are over 190 ethnic groups in Russia. In the classroom, though, there's only room for one. And this isn't an accident of demographics, but rather a deliberate policy. For years, Moscow has eroded the rights of republics to require instruction in their titular languages. Parents were told they had freedom of choice, but the university entrance exams were only available in Russian. Without Russian, your child had no future. So that's a bit of a linguistic ultimatum. Study in Russian or don't study at all. The results have been devastating. More than 36 nations inside Russia have seen nearly all native language instruction eliminated. Teachers who once passed down centuries of cultural heritage are retiring with no replacements. The Kremlin could have invested in modern bilingual education, but instead it opted for a simpler strategy: extinction by administrative neglect. Yet Moscow claimed that it is respecting minority cultures by introducing national holidays, traditional dance festivals, and heritage days. It's a process Russian commentators are calling folklorization. Does it sound respectful? Well, that depends. In Putin's version of multiculturalism, minority peoples are welcomed so long as they stay safely in the museum cabinet. They can dance, they can sing, they can wear colorful costumes, but they should not speak their own language, govern in their own language, or teach in their own language. Nationhood is being demoted to just a decoration. Non-Russian parents are increasingly demanding the right to educate their children in their own language, even if only a few hours per week. Meanwhile, Moscow continues cutting back instruction hours and pushing these classes into the earliest grades, where they have the least long-term impact. It's a symbolic concession and a strategic neutering. And yet, Putin shows no signs of slowing down. Even during the war in Ukraine, he continues insisting that Russian culture must dominate. But the war itself has generated new tensions, where non-Russians have died disproportionately on the front lines, even as their political and linguistic rights are eroded at home. And while Putin may believe that Russianization equals national strength, he may discover something else, that unity by force produces the opposite of loyalty. It produces resentment and often revenge. The Kremlin thinks it is closing the chapter on minority nations. It may instead be writing their next chapter in a language it didn't intend. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow from Jamestown Foundation. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
Now, traditionally, when we think of education system in various countries, the language aspect is one of those things that we point to on how impressive this country is, multilingual, being able to speak all these different languages. But in Russia, it seems to work the other way, where they prefer their citizens, or at least their toddler, to speak just purely Russian. My question is, what do you think is behind this decision, and what are some of the long-term impact that this might lead to?
Well, many countries try to promote linguistic homogeneity. There's a fear that if people speak different languages, they will maintain different cultures and therefore become more likely to commit themselves to separatist agendas. It's not just Russia, but in Russia, we see a shift back from the Soviet or neo-Soviet period where non-Russian languages were encouraged up to a point. Now, in the last decade, we've seen Mr. Putin work very, very hard to Russianize the entire population. He has banned making it a requirement in the non-Russian republics that all students study at least for some time, the non-Russian language of that titular people. He has ensured that anyone who wants to go to university has to take tests in Russian rather than any other language, making study of Russian far more attractive to parents and children than would otherwise be the case. Part of this reflects Putin's view that language is what defines nationality. I think he goes too far in that direction because I think there are many people who don't speak a language associated with their people, but who become more nationalist. As I've often said, the British Empire was brought low not by Hindi-speaking peasants in Benares, but by an English-trained lawyer named Gandhi. And the Irish didn't become nationalists until they stopped speaking Gaelic. But Mr. Putin clearly thinks that if he can get everyone to speak Russian, he won't face the same kind of separatist challenges that brought the Soviet Union apart 30 years ago.
Right. And continuing on that line of thinking, if a language is supposed to be tied to nationality, do you think that the attempt at erasing the Ukrainian language from occupied regions of Ukraine is essentially an attempt at a cultural erasure?
Well, I think it's a kind of genocide. Genocide includes the destruction of a community, not just killing them off, but destroying the community by destroying its values, destroying its practices. There's no question that in the case of Ukraine, Putin is trying to destroy the Ukrainian nation and absorb what's left into the Russian one. I don't think that's going to work. I think it's going to breed a reaction because there will be then more diversity within the Russian nation itself. And we can see that many of the challenges that Moscow now faces come not from non-Russian speaking ethnic minorities, but from regions that are dominated by ethnic Russians in one sense, but by people who identify as Siberians, as people of the Urals, and so on. I think what we'll see, the further into Ukraine Putin's forces go and the more he attempts to wipe out the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture, we'll see the emergence of a Russian-speaking but very much Ukrainian nationalist community, and he'll discover that he has a different kind of problem than he had rather than having solved all the problems as he believes he can.
Right, and speaking of problems, I'm also looking at the possibility of whether or not Russia can stay competitive if the whole society is kind of limited to just using one language. You mentioned the universities require, testing in Russian. Doesn't that kind of limit how many students can study in Russia, and vice versa limits the ability of Russian students to study abroad as well?
Well, a bigger threat to Russian economic development with regard to language is learning foreign languages. In the past decade, and especially in the past 3.5 years since the start of Putin's expanded invasion of Ukraine, Russians have been studying foreign languages far less often. English is far less popular. There has been a shift in interest toward Chinese, but it's not. Chinese is a very difficult language to learn, and it's not clear how far that will go. It's that isolation that's going to hit things first. It is, however, putting a straitjacket on Russian society, on the society of the peoples of the Russian Federation, by not having the cultural and linguistic diversity that learning these other languages will promote. Russian officials, including even Putin, say that the strength of Russia is in its diversity of peoples. But what Mr. Putin is doing is trying to destroy that diversity, even while he proclaims it as a principle of his actions.
Historically, how effective is the attempt to crack down on the different various languages? Like you mentioned, a lot of it could lead to some pushback, be it politically or even actual kind of curbing these languages themselves.
Well, I think, first off, over the last 7 years, the percentage of students in the Russian Federation studying in, not studying, but studying in their native languages has declined from around 5% to around 1%. That's a huge cutback. That's been, at the same time, more students in the non-Russian areas are taking non-Russian languages as special subjects, but you don't learn your native language well by studying it 1 hour a week, which is what Mr. Putin has reduced it to in most cases. So you're seeing a real reduction in the linguistic diversity of the Russian Federation, and I think a lot of people are very unhappy about that. And curiously, there are two groups that are unhappy. First are the non-Russians, who are watching their cultures be obliterated by a Russianization, a Russification program that the Kremlin and Mr. Putin personally are launching. And second, it's infuriating a lot of Russian nationalists. If suddenly you have people who look like Kyrgyz or Uzbeks who become Russian speakers and then are proclaimed to be Russians by the Kremlin, from the point of view of a lot of Russian nationalists, that's not the world you want to see. You want to see Russians who look like Russians, who speak Russian, who are members of the Orthodox Church. The idea that you'd have people who don't look like Russians, who aren't Orthodox Christians, but who are accepted by the state as if they are Russians, is not a very attractive prospect for a lot of Russian nationalists. So you're going to have pushback in both places, and we've seen it. A number of the Russian nationalist groups, the Russian community, the Northern Man, are pushing against this from the Russian side, and you see Russian or non-Russian nationalists trying to come up with strategies so that their languages will continue. The internet is giving some possibilities in this direction. Informal Sunday schools are another way that these people are trying to save their languages. It's difficult, They're clearly fighting a rearguard action, but the view of most of the people in those categories with whom I've spoken believe that if they can keep their languages alive until Vladimir Putin leaves the scene, the man whoever comes after him will have a very different policy with regard to linguistic diversity, and they'll have a chance to recover some of what they've lost under Vladimir Putin.
Right. I'd like to go back a little bit to that paradox you mentioned, which is very interesting indeed. Not only the minorities that speak non-Russian have a problem with it, but even the nationalists themselves seeing these minorities speaking Russian kind of irks them the wrong way. Now, do you think the government or Vladimir Putin's Kremlin itself are aware of these kind of discontent, and do you think that there's any attempt at...
I think, there's no question. The man who heads the monitoring service in the Kremlin has written about this within the last few weeks, warning that there is real vociferous, actually using the term that Russia could fall apart. It's the first time someone in the Kremlin has said that in that way in 20 years. Putin is clearly being told by people close to him that this is not an easy or safe thing to do. I'm sure that people like Patrushev and the Security Council and others who are Russian nationalists in all but name are also articulating the fear of Russians, that Russians aren't going to be the Russians we know if what you're doing is bringing in people who are Russian-speaking Asiatics. This is a kind of racism which I think Putin is sparking rather than helping to overcome. And I think that we make a huge mistake in not paying more attention to Russian reaction, ethnic Russian reactions to what Putin is doing in this area, and not just the non-Russians. The Russians are not happy with this. They don't want to see, they'd like to see the non-Russians go away. They certainly don't want to incorporate more non-Russians into their society unless they're similar to Russians. Ukrainians are viewed as somehow similar, but Uzbeks aren't. And the idea that Mr. Putin will try to overcome the demographic problems of Russia by adding Russian-speaking Uzbeks into the mix isn't something that a lot of Russians are comfortable with.
All right, if there's already voices even within the Kremlin kind of raising these issues, do you think there's an eventuality where Putin walks it back, or do you think that these people would just, out the window?
No, I think what will happen is there will be warnings. Putin will listen to them, but I don't think this is a terribly high priority for him. One of the things we have to understand is that since 2022, Putin has paid very, very little attention to domestic affairs. He has paid almost exclusive attention to the foreign policy and to the war in Ukraine. So there are a lot of things going on that he's not focusing on the way he did a decade ago. There's a lot of independent action by governors. There have been articles in several of the independent Russian media that are left that governors are going their own way. There's lots of tension between the somewhat ultra-nationalists like Filimonov and Vologda to people who take a very different view, especially in Siberia, in the Siberian regions and republics. So I think what you're going to see is that the pressure for this is going to build. But Mr. Putin is already aging, and I think that most people assume he isn't going to make a big change in domestic affairs until after the war with Ukraine is over, and no one is seriously proposing that the war with Ukraine is going to be over anytime soon. So I think we have people who are conscious that this is a problem that's a growing threat to the regime, but it's not something Putin is yet prepared to act on. And my guess is he thinks he can wait it out for his time, which in the nature of things is probably no more than 5 to 10 years.
All right, so like many domestic issues within Russia, this is yet another pressure cooker just waiting to blow. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The Kremlin's programs promoting Russian war veterans are being designed to avoid creating any rivals for Putin. The programs almost exclusively feature low-profile soldiers.
Although Russian propaganda loves to boast about its respect and high worship of Russian soldiers and war veterans, the reality is far more complex. Although state-backed programs in Russia aim to boost the image of hundreds of thousands of war veterans who took part in the conflict in Ukraine, the Kremlin has been prioritizing unambitious veterans. Even though Putin has declared these veterans to be Russia's new elite, he is also making sure that he suffers no rivals. Decorated soldiers in Russia historically have been able to garner a certain kind of cult of personality around them, and Russian leaders have been very wary of any individuals with military background becoming far too popular for their liking. Although Russian authorities have been giving many veterans lucrative government positions, sources say that these people are tested for having any serious political ambitions and must openly state their loyalties.
Lithuania has decided to open its border with Belarus ahead of schedule. The border was recently closed over the incursion of several smuggler balloons which crossed from Belarus into Lithuania.
The border between Lithuania and Belarus was supposed to have been closed until the end of November. In response to the closure, Belarus decided to trap more than 1,000 Lithuanian transport trucks inside its territory. Lithuania's interior minister has admitted, however, that the situation has changed and that all the necessary security measures have been implemented. Although this decision has come as a surprise to some, Lithuanian authorities did previously say that the border could be opened earlier than anticipated. Nonetheless, Vilnius has also emphasized that should another incident like the one involving smuggler balloons take place, then the border will be closed once more. The decision to reopen the border was made by Lithuania not long after Polish authorities made a similar move.
Serbia has been walking a tightrope between Russia and the West by indirectly selling arms to Ukraine. While some sees this as a realignment from the side of Belgrade, other observers are more skeptical and merely see Serbia as opportunistic.
Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Serbia has been trying to balance its relations between the West, Russia and even China. Despite these efforts, the situation may be deteriorating for the Serbian government. Serbia is currently trapped between US sanctions, a stalled EU accession process, and Russian gas blackmail. One of the ways in which Belgrade has been trying to leverage this situation is through indirect arms sales to Ukraine. Not long after freezing arms exports under Russian pressure, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić has been offering ammunition sales to European countries. Ammunition which could end up in Ukrainian hands anyway. This is regarded as quite a bold move by Serbia given its historical alignment with Russia. Nevertheless, experts point out that this is most likely an endeavor by Serbian leadership to appease different geopolitical powers.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. For more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.